My name is Harper, and on the day we gathered to honor my grandmother's life, my cousin Colton Reeves stood beside her casket and claimed every piece of her estate as if my presence meant nothing. He didn't hesitate, not even for a breath. Before announcing that her home, her land, and every dollar tied to her life now belonged to him, I watched the room tighten around his voice, as though he had already won some unspoken war. The family didn't question him. They clapped, nodded, and whispered approval like he had done something noble. Their faces were lit with the kind of pride that only comes from choosing the side they believe will benefit them most. No one looked at me. Not even once. Colton smirked at my silence and said I should stay out of serious family business. His tone made it clear he thought I was an inconvenience, a leftover relative standing in the way of his future. He had always spoken like authority was his birthright. Today, he made the mistake of assuming nothing had changed. I set a slim brown folder on the table between us. The room quieted, but not because they expected anything meaningful from me. They simply wanted to see how far I would embarrass myself. Colton folded his arms, waiting to mock whatever I was about to say. I kept my voice steady, as I told him he had just violated state law in front of a financial fraud investigator. His face twitched, but he forced a laugh and said I was bluffing. He always thought logic and rules were optional when it came to his ambitions. He had no idea this folder would crack that confidence in half. The whispers around us faded as I opened it. I didn't rush, because I wanted everyone to see how calm I was compared to his rising panic. He took a step forward, eyes narrowing at the signature on the first page. The room shifted, like the air itself suddenly understood something he didn't. I laid the certified copy of my grandmother's will flat on the table. Colton froze, staring at the legal seals he couldn't explain away. The same family that had cheered him minutes earlier now watched him without a sound. The shift was sharp and undeniable. He tried to speak, but his voice cracked. He demanded to know where I found it and why he hadn't been told. His confidence drained fast, replaced with the kind of fear-only truth can pull out of a man who's been lying too long. I simply closed the folder and let the silence answer for me. Colton leaned in and accused me of creating a forgery. His voice was louder than before, desperate and uneven. For the first time in years, the room wasn't on his side. It belonged to the truth he never expected to face. I met his glare without looking away. I told him this was only the beginning, and if he wanted to keep pretending he had control, he was welcome to try. His jaw clenched, like he finally realized he was no longer the one holding the power. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The entire room felt the shift. They felt the unraveling. And for the first time since the ceremony began, everyone finally looked at me. Colton tried to steady himself after the initial shock, lifting his chin as if he could force the room back under his control. "This is ridiculous," he said, waving a dismissive hand toward the certified will, as if he were brushing away dust. "She dug that out of some drawer to stir up drama. And all of you are falling for it." His voice carried the kind of arrogance that needed an audience to survive. I didn't look away from him as I slid the folder toward the attorney. "You can verify every seal," I said quietly, the steadiness in my tone contrasting his panic. The attorney examined the pages with slow, deliberate movements, and the room leaned forward in anticipation. When he finally nodded, acknowledging their legitimacy, the shift in energy was unmistakable. Colton stepped back, sputtering. "You're all seriously listening to her?" His eyes darted across the family, searching for someone to echo his outrage. But uncertainty had already crept into their expressions. A few whispered to each other, shaken by how quickly the situation had turned. The cracks he had tried to hide were now widening in front of everyone. My mother, Linda Reeves, pushed forward with an anxious smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Harper, sweetie, why didn't you share this earlier?" she asked. forcing her voice into something that sounded maternal but carried a trace of accusation. I kept my gaze steady as I answered. Because no one here ever listens unless something explodes first. Her expression faltered. Revealing the truth, she didn't want the family to notice. Colton lifted his hands in frustration. She's just bitter because she wasn't included in the real decisions. He snapped. His words sharp but shaky. I stepped closer, meeting his glare. You're terrified they'll finally see the decisions you made behind their backs. His face tightened. And for a moment, silence settled between us like a blade. The attorney cleared his throat and pointed out the inconsistencies between the will Colton had presented earlier and the notarized version now in my hands. Colton's face drained at the mention of mismatched signatures. That means nothing, he insisted. Though even he seemed unconvinced by his tone. He looked smaller than before, as if the confidence holding him upright had begun to crumble. You want the truth, I said. My voice low enough that the room leaned in. You didn't expect anyone to challenge you today, because you thought you'd already conditioned everyone to dismiss me. He clenched his jaw, unable to stop the flicker of fear in his eyes. The family murmured again, their loyalty slipping away as understanding dawned. He tried one last time, pointing at me with a trembling hand. She's trying to destroy this family. I held his stare and replied, I'm exposing what already destroyed it. The room fell silent, not out of confusion, but because the truth finally had a place to land. And as I watched Colton struggle to find his next defense, I knew he was beginning to understand that this was only the first thread I intended to pull. The room was still buzzing from the confirmation of the will when the back doors opened again. And Ariana Cole stepped inside. Her arrival was quiet, but every movement she made carried the weight of someone bracing for impact. Colton spotted her instantly and whispered, What are you doing here with the panic of a man watching a second disaster walk into the room? She froze beneath the attention, her eyes wide and unsteady as the family turned toward her. I watched her clutch her purse tighter, and I recognized the conflict written across her face. Colton took a step toward her and muttered, Leave now, before you make this worse. But the damage was already spreading. Several relatives exchanged confused glances, unsure of why he reacted with such urgency. His attempt to regain control was slipping fast. When Ariana whispered, I couldn't keep pretending. Her voice cracked loud enough for the front rows to hear. Colton's face drained, and he snapped, Don't start this here. Trying to mask his fear with anger, the family leaned in, sensing something deeper than a simple misunderstanding. The tension tightened like a rope pulled from both ends. Derek Cole appeared in the doorway a moment later, and the room seemed to tilt in response. His expression was blank, the kind of calm that only comes from heartbreak already processed into something colder. When he locked eyes with Ariana and asked, Is it true the silence became suffocating? She lowered her head, and the truth moved through the room like a slow, unavoidable wave. Colton tried to deflect, insisting, This has nothing to do with any of you. But the family wasn't buying it anymore. One aunt whispered, Why is her husband here? While another said, Colton. What did you do? He swallowed hard and snapped back. It's not what you think. Though his eyes betrayed him, every excuse he reached for slipped through his fingers. Ariana looked at me with tearful exhaustion and said, He promised me everything would change. Colton hissed, Stop talking. But she pushed past his warning with, You said no one would ever know. Gasps rippled across the room as the pieces aligned themselves. No amount of denial could patch the truth now that it stood in front of us. Shaking and fragile, Derek stepped forward with his jaw clenched, and his voice settled over the room like a verdict when he said, I trusted both of you. Colton tried to protest, but his words came out fractured and thin. He looked around desperately, searching for someone to defend him. But no one was willing to step into the ashes he'd created. His empire of arrogance was collapsing one secret at a time. I let the moment breathe before saying, "This is what happens when truth finally finds the door you tried to nail shut." Colton spun toward me with a glare, but the fury in his eyes couldn't hide the fear underneath. The family now saw him clearly, stripped of the confidence he wielded minutes earlier. And as the room filled with judgment he could not escape, I knew this was only the beginning of his unraveling. The air in the room changed again when I reached for the second folder. And even those who had defended Colton earlier leaned back as if bracing themselves. I could feel the pressure building behind me as I opened it. And Colton muttered, "What now?" Harper, in a voice stretched thin with dread. I met his eyes calmly and said, "Now we talk about the money," letting each word sink in. A soft rustle moved through the crowd as people straightened to listen. I spread the documents across the table, and an uncle near the front whispered, "Are those trust records?" while another leaned closer to squint at the headers. Colton shook his head hard, insisting, "None of that means anything." But his voice trembled in a way he couldn't hide. I tapped the top sheet and said, "These withdrawals came from accounts tied to the Reeves family trust." His eyes widened, and the truth flickered in the panic he attempted to swallow. More relatives leaned in, examining the lines of figures that spoke louder than his denials ever could. Someone murmured, "These dates were recent." And another added, "Why would trust money go there?" while Colton clenched his fists at his sides. I watched him try to maintain composure as I pointed to the vague transaction descriptions, each one more suspicious than the last. "You labeled these as development expenses," I said, "but not one of them benefited the trust." Colton barked, "You don't know what those charges mean." But his defensiveness only pulled more eyes toward him. The attorney adjusted his glasses and said gently, "These classifications aren't standard," which caused even more murmuring among the family. I saw a cousin step away from Colton's side as if physical distance could protect her from the fallout. The room was beginning to understand that his confidence had always been a mask. My mother, Linda Reeves, stepped forward in a shaky attempt to redirect the tension. "There must be an explanation," she said, trying to hide the tremor in her voice. I looked at her and replied, "There is," before pulling out a single page bearing her signature at the bottom. She stared at it in horror and whispered, "I don't remember signing this." Colton snapped, "She doesn't have to explain anything," as if he could shield her with the same arrogance he used to protect himself. "She approved a falsified transaction," I responded, sliding the document closer so the ink was undeniable. Linda's shoulders felt as if they collapsed under the truth. And the betrayal painted across her face wasn't aimed at me. It was aimed at the son she had defended for years. A relative whispered, "This is fraud." And another said, "This could be criminal." While Colton's breathing turned shallow, he tried to lash out with, "Harper is manipulating all of you." But no one stepped in to agree with him this time. The evidence filled every silence before he could. The family was no longer listening to his voice. They were listening to the numbers. I pointed to the final line on the last page. "This withdrawal," I said, tapping the bold digits, "is for $82,000. A hush fell so heavy the room felt smaller, tighter, more suffocating. Someone whispered, "That's not a mistake." And another added, "That's theft." Colton's face drained entirely as he whispered, almost to himself, "You weren't supposed to see that." The attorney cleared his throat again and said, "These records need to be reviewed by outside authorities." That sentence struck harder than any outburst could have. Colton staggered back, shaking his head, whispering, "No, this isn't happening," as if denial could reverse the evidence. But the truth was already out in the open, and the family saw it plainly. I gathered the documents into a neat stack again and said quietly, "This is the second layer. Colton. And it's only getting heavier from here." His eyes locked onto mine, filled with a fear he could no longer disguise with arrogance. He had built his entire reputation on confidence, charm, and entitlement. Now all three were crumbling beneath the weight of his own choices. And there was nothing left for him to hide behind. The moment the financial documents settled over the room like a storm, Colton slipped out the back door as if fresh air could save him. I let a few seconds pass before following him, stepping into the yard where the late afternoon sun cast long, stretched shadows across the grass. He was gripping the railing of the patio as though the wood might anchor him to a reality he could still control. When he heard me approach, he muttered, "I'm not afraid of you." Even though his shaking hands said otherwise, I stayed a few feet behind him and replied, "You should be afraid of what you've done." Watching the words hit him harder than I expected. He turned, eyes wild, and said, "You think this is enough to ruin me? You don't know how far ahead I am." I stepped closer, lowering my voice as I told him, "You're not ahead. You're cornered." His breath faltered, and for the first time, he looked truly trapped. I placed the flash drive on the edge of the patio table, letting the small object gleam in the sunlight. "You remember this?" I asked, and his face drained instantly. "What did you do?" "Harper," he whispered, the bravado collapsing out of his voice. I answered, "I didn't do anything. Ariana did." He lunged forward as if he could grab the drive, but I moved it out of reach. "She recorded everything," I said, watching panic bloom across his features. "Every payoff, every meeting, every lie you fed her so she'd keep quiet." He shook his head violently, saying, "She wouldn't betray me." But his voice cracked at the end. "She already has." I told him gently, though I didn't soften the truth. "And the recording shows exactly who you are when no one is watching." He looked toward the house as if hoping Ariana had vanished. But her presence inside lingered like a ghost he could never escape. "You ruined her," he said bitterly. And I replied, "You ruined yourself." Colton leaned against the railing, clutching it like a man trying to hold himself together. "If you show them that, I lose everything," he whispered, his words trembling. I simply said, "You shouldn't have gambled with people you thought were disposable." The silence between us deepened, heavy with the weight of consequences he could no longer outrun. He stared at the flash drive again, but this time with the numb realization that everything he built had already begun to collapse. "I can fix this," he said weakly, though even he didn't believe it. I stepped back toward the house and answered, "You can't fix what you never controlled." His shoulders sagged in defeat, and the truth finally settled into him like a final blow. By the time I reached the back door, he still hadn't moved from the railing. His gaze stayed locked on the flash drive, as if it were the moment his life split cleanly in two. And as I walked inside, I knew he finally understood that this wasn't just exposure, it was the beginning of his true unraveling. When I stepped back into the living room, the family had gathered in a tight semicircle around the attorney, as if proximity could protect them from the truth. I placed the certified will on the table again and said, "We're not done," letting the words cut through the murmurs. Colton followed behind me slowly, his steps unsteady, like a man trying to walk away from a cliff he had already fallen off. The room stiffened when I added, "It's time to address who actually owns everything in this house." The attorney cleared his throat and lifted the notarized will, glancing at me for permission before reading aloud. "Your grandmother states," he began, "that all property, funds, and assets under her name are to be transferred entirely to her granddaughter, Harper Wynne." A wave of gasps rolled through the room, followed by stunned silence. Colton's voice cracked as he shouted, "That's impossible." Like screaming could overwrite ink. I said, "It's legally binding," and watched him stumble backward as if the air had betrayed him. His mother whispered, "Colton, what did you do with a tremor that carried both blame and disbelief?" He pointed at the attorney and yelled, "Read the old will, the one everyone knew about," but his desperation only made the room colder. The attorney replied softly, "That version is invalidated due to unauthorized alterations." Colton swung toward me, his voice rising. "You're not taking everything from me." He snapped, gripping the edge of a chair like he needed it to stand upright. I stepped closer and said, "I'm not taking anything. I'm reclaiming what she left for me." The truth hit him so hard his shoulders collapsed inward. For the first time, he looked small. Linda staggered forward and said, "Harper, please. Your grandmother wouldn't want this fighting." I turned to her and replied, "She wanted fairness. And she trusted me to make sure of it." Her face tightened with something like shame, as if she suddenly saw the years she spent defending the wrong person. Her gaze drifted to Colton, who couldn't look her in the eye. The attorney handed me the envelope containing the transfer documents, and the weight of it felt final in my hands. Colton whispered, "You can't ruin me," but it sounded more like a plea than a threat. I met his fear with steady calm and said, "You ruined your chances the moment you lied to this family." No one stepped forward to defend him. The room had chosen its truth. As I signed the acknowledgement forms, the atmosphere shifted into something irreversible. Colton watched helplessly as the attorney confirmed the estate was officially mine. His breath shook with each exhale, and he whispered, "This was supposed to be my legacy." I closed the folder and said, "Legacies aren't inherited. They're earned." The room felt heavier than before, as if the truth had finally settled into the walls themselves and refused to leave. I placed the last folder on the table, thinner than the others, but far more dangerous, and said, "There's one final thing we need to address." Colton's head snapped up, and he muttered, "No, not more." With a voice that barely reached the people closest to him, I opened the folder calmly, letting the tension thicken until the silence became unbearable. "This has already been submitted to the Department of Justice," I said, and the family reacted with a stunned wave of whispers. Colton stepped forward, shaking his head so hard it looked painful. "You didn't," he whispered, but the quiver in his voice showed he knew I was telling the truth. I met his eyes and answered, "I warned you this was only the beginning." He lunged toward the table, grabbing the papers with frantic hands, scanning the dates, the signatures, the recorded statements that spelled out everything he'd tried to bury. "This is manipulation," he snarled, but his voice cracked halfway through the word. I replied, "It's a record of fraud, and it's already out of your control." His knees buckled slightly, and for a moment, he looked like a man fighting to stay upright. Linda stepped toward me with a trembling voice, asking, "Harper, what happens now?" But her eyes were already filled with the answer she feared. I told her, "Now he faces what he chose," and her breath hitched, as if those words carried a weight she had hoped would never land. She turned to Colton and whispered, "You told me it was harmless." But he couldn't even look at her. His silence was an admission louder than any defense. A knock at the front door cut through the room like a sharp blade. Stopping every conversation mid-breath, the attorney moved to open it, and the moment the legal representatives stepped inside, Colton stumbled back as if he'd been struck. One of them said, "We need you to come with us for questioning regarding misuse of trust assets." The family gasped, and Colton whispered, "Harper, please," with a desperation that sounded nothing like the man who mocked me hours earlier. I stood still and said, "I'm not doing this to hurt you. I'm doing it because someone finally has to tell the truth. He reached for the nearest chair as though clinging to the last stable object in the room. But it didn't help him stand any taller. The representatives escorted him toward the doorway while he kept saying, "This isn't fair." But even he could hear how hollow it sounded. No one stepped forward to defend him, not even Linda. Ariana approached me slowly. Her eyes swollen from crying but filled with something clearer than guilt. "Thank you for stopping him," she said quietly. And I nodded, knowing this wasn't victory for her but closure she desperately needed. Derek stood behind her with stiff posture. And when he said, "I'll handle the rest," the conviction in his voice left no doubt he meant it. Their marriage wouldn't survive this. But at least the truth would. As Colton disappeared through the door, the house felt different, lighter, but edged with the echoes of everything that had unfolded. Linda lingered near the table, staring at the documents that had exposed her son, and whispered, "I didn't know what he'd become," I answered gently. "He became exactly what no one wanted to see." She closed her eyes as if absorbing a truth she'd avoided for years. By the time the representative's car pulled away, the family remained in stunned silence, gathering around the remnants of the life they thought they understood. I stood at the center of the room, not triumphant, but steady, finally holding the truth that had been stolen from me for years. "This ends here," I said quietly, more to myself than to them. And for the first time, no one argued. When the house finally emptied, I stood alone in the living room, surrounded by the echoes of everything that had unraveled. The attorney placed the keys to my grandmother's home in my hand, and the simple weight of them felt like a lifetime settling into place. I walked through each room slowly, letting the silence wash over me now that the shouting and accusations had faded. For the first time all day, the air felt honest. I stepped onto the porch and watched the sky shift into the soft colors of evening, remembering the way my grandmother used to sit here with her tea. She had always said the truth had a way of finding its own path. Even when people tried to bury it. "You're the only one who sees things clearly," she wrote in the letter I kept tucked in my pocket. Reading those words again made everything feel less heavy. As I looked out over the yard, I whispered, "I hope I made you proud," letting the wind carry the words somewhere she might hear them. This wasn't about destroying anyone, it was about restoring what she trusted me to protect. The family's damage would take time to heal, but at least the rot was finally exposed. And for the first time, I wasn't the one standing in the shadows of someone else's story. Thank you for watching this story until the end. If Harper's journey moved you or made you think about justice, betrayal, or family, feel free to subscribe and stay with this channel. More powerful stories are coming, and I'd love to have you here for every twist and every truth.